Greetings everyone, I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. As you can tell from the title up there, I'm continuing my reviews of the first season of Game of Thrones. Here we are with episode 3, Lord Snow. This is the first of 3 episodes in a row directed by Brian Kirk, who also directed episodes of Tudors. So he has a knack for directing medieval-ish shows, and it kind of shows with how he sets up the camera throughout. Before we get too far into the episode, just a reminder, if you want to support the channel, both the PayPal and Patreon links are down below. If you want to continuously support the channel and gain access to videos early, you can go the Patreon route. Your repeated support will be appreciated. If you just want a one-off support or to make a one-off request for something, go the PayPal route. Now, Lord Snow, when you look at it from the point of view of Jon's arc, it's a very aptly titled episode. Now, unlike the last episode that I reviewed, I actually do have some more notes on this one, so I can follow each of them in sequence while I'm talking about it. But before I get into that, while I don't fully remember which episode I was fully hooked on the show by, this is probably an early contender, because watching again, I'm like, this is another good episode. Which, this has been a long time since I've watched all of these episodes fully, so at least since before Season 5 aired. And I have yet to watch all the ones after that in a row. But I think by the time I'm done with this, I'll be like, oh yeah, I can definitely see why a lot of my fellow fans are not liking the later seasons as much. But it is what it is. I mean, you've already heard me talk about the last couple seasons in my opening video for this review series a couple weeks ago. Now, we have some new characters introduced in this episode. We have Lord Varys, played by Conleth Hill, which of course, at the last season, very infamous at that table reading. The moment he sees what happens to his character, he turned the script over and had that little look on his face. Which, of course, I get it. And we got James Cosmo playing Jeor Mormont, or Jeor Mormont. It's always hard to figure out how to pronounce him. The Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. Aidan Gillian as Peter Baelish, a.k.a. Littlefinger, the character that you just love to hate. There's a little bit of that in this season, but most of it's going to come from later seasons. And I will say the way he died, I know it's a spoiler, but I'm just saying, you could say it's a little rushed, but just the way that Gillian plays it during that last scene. But I'll save my full thoughts on that for when we get to that season eventually. I'm probably going to butcher this name. Ian Mcelhinney as Sir Barristan Selmy, the Lord Commander of the Gold Cloak, not the Gold Cloaks, the Kingsguard, excuse me. Gold Cloaks, they're another thing, but nice to see him in there. Got Peter Vaughan as Maester Aemon, the late Peter Vaughan. Now his watch has ended. And then Milto Yerolemu as Syrio Forel. And of course, a lot of the characters from previous episodes also return. And it's also the first appearance of Old Nan, which I'll bring up her actress at a later time. Now, with how I arranged it in my notes, there are more or less 5 different plot threads going throughout. Now, I'm going to start with the shortest one, and that is the Winterfell stuff. Essentially just seeing how Bran is. He seems to be alright, all things considering. He hates his current situation, which, given he was a very active young boy, you can understand. Even listening to Old Nan's stories doesn't seem to work. And then he hears an old story, and this is where he gets some of the backstory about the Long Night and the White Walkers. And listening to it, you can see why somebody's seeing that they actually exist when you thought, it's an old wives' tale, like we did at the beginning of the first episode. Now we have some added weight for why that guy was scared so senseless to the point where he decided to forced run all the way down into the southern part of the north and get executed by Ned instead of going back. And what we're going to see later, I really don't fault him for it. It's not something that you're really going to deal with all the time, even if you are being told, yeah, as a member of the Night's Watch, you got to protect the realm from all this. Some people, they can only stand so much before their mind just snaps. Across the narrow sea, Dany starts to learn a little bit more about the Dothraki, slowly learning the languages, learning a bit about the culture, and decides to stop the Khalasar. Of course, her brother gets angry and starts as usual, "Are you trying to wake the dragon?" And this is where he gets his first little wake-up call that now that she is married to Khal Drogo, he can't really extend the power he has over her. This is an old-timey thing that once she's married, technically, and from a modern perspective, I hate to have to use this, but for historical and fantasy accuracy, I have to where Dany, as a woman in a medieval society, by marrying the Khal, she goes from technically being the property of the next male relative, which would be her brother, to being the Khal. So him trying to do this, no, it's not going to fly. And of course, he gets put in his place by a member of the Blood Riders, one that's been assigned to Dany to protect her. And he gets told not to kill him, which the fact that Jorah doesn't step in should be the first little hint to our dearly soon-to-be departed brother that he has no power here. Any type of power he thought he had before, it was just an illusion. And it brings to mind a quote that Viserys is going to say multiple times in his own story arc. Power resides where men believe it resides. And here, even with that, Viserys has no power. Now, near the end of her arc here, Dany finds out she's pregnant, and when the Blood Rider and Jorah are told, you can definitely see that they're surprised, but they're also like, ooh, what's going to happen now? And the way that the look of expression on Jorah's face, you can tell that there's more to it than just him being surprised and all that, but there's some other things going there. Nice little foreshadowing to something we're going to find out in a couple episodes' time about what he's been telling people. And of course he rides away to connect in with that plot. Now, going up to the wall, Jon is slowly acclimating to the Night's Watch. We saw at the end of his arc in the previous one that he's starting to slowly see what exactly the Night Watch is. It's not all sunshines and rainbows like he had been led to believe, because he thought they were all going to be men of honor like he'd seen with his uncle. Maybe some of them will be like Yoren, maybe a little bit uncouth, but most of them are going to be, people you'd expect. But now he's seeing that the majority of it are lower-born thieves, rapists, other type of undesirables, and that the wall is, to use a real-life parallel, kind of like Australia was. It's entirely people to criminals, with a handful of knights. And one thing I like about the aesthetic when we first see the Night's Watch is you can tell, when you look at how they were in the first episode and here, that even though they're all supposed to be equal and a man earns his keep on the wall, earns his position, you can still see there's a little bit of nepotism and favoritism to those in higher born positions, even like Jon, where they're a highborn but they're illegitimate. You just look at the armor, that should tell you. And even when he's dealing with the drill sergeant from Hell that we see, he's still getting some praise, but it's like backhanded praise. Seems you're the least useless person here, Snow. And he's the type of person you need to try to whip these people into shape. And I do like how Jon's fight scene with his brothers, both here and later on in the episode, are actually done. And it brings to mind something from the DVD set, and that is that the actors didn't have much time to learn the fights, and it was like a dance. And we're going to see something like that throughout, and the fact they didn't have a long time to memorize it will come up again in later fights. Here, you can definitely tell it's more spur of the moment, but it feels raw. Like these are people who have never really held a sword, going against someone who has all of his life held a sword and is holding back a good portion of his skill, but teaching them a lesson, which is not a good idea, and Jon learns that lesson almost fatally. And the way that Kit Harington plays this, you can tell Jon is sulking, he doesn't like the realization, and this comes out in his conversation with Tyrion, which is a nice little interesting note, is this conversation he has with Tyrion is not how it happens in the book. He actually has a talk with the Castle blacksmith, Donald Noy, and he scolds Jon in here. Now, taking out a minor character and replacing it with a bigger character to give that character more screen time, some people might go, but I don't mind it. Plus, builds up a little bit of the Jon-Tyrion friendship that does exist a little bit in the books from what we see. Doesn't feel like a friendship there, more like a, like the outcast bonding. Put it in a nice way. Here, definitely feels more like the beginning of a friendship, or friendship in potentia. And here, Tyrion is giving Jon some more life lessons and some more advice. and that is, don't treat them like that. Even though you are illegitimate, you still lived a life of privilege, one that these gentlemen could only wish they had. And he points out that one of them's at the wall for stealing a wheel of cheese for his hungry sister, and he was either the wall or his hand. So it's one of those things that Jon is learning the hard way. Like, don't judge everyone else, and remember, you are all equals here, and you should treat them a little bit better. And of course, just because you are high-born raised, don't stick your nose up at them. And of course, this is going to come up later in the episode where Jon starts to take that to heart, and when he's dueling with them, he's actually giving them pointers, like, you're moving too much, you don't move enough, try to go at it, trying to improve their footwork and their blade work. And of course, endear them to the men, because as we're going to find out later when he has command, if you don't have the loyalty of your men, you don't have anything. But of course, there is going to be a split loyalty. And with everything considering, what we're going to find out with Jon later in this season, you can see this is the beginning parts of that. Goes in to the whole thing that every man earns what they get here. Now, we also see Uncle Benjen begin to leave the wall for a ranging mission, and then Yoren and Tyrion leaving to go back down south. Now, pay attention to what's going to happen in the next episode involving Tyrion when he gets to Winterfell after his comment about, feathered bed. Now, the last two ones here are pretty interconnected. I put a second 4 instead of 2 in my notes, I just noticed, but it is what it is. It all involves the various Starks arriving in King's Landing and the rest of the characters that are now in King's Landing and going about their own business. I'll start with the shortest part of that subplot, and that is that Jaime and Cersei learn about what happened with Bran up north, and that he's now awake, and they're freaking out. More say Cersei is. Because Jaime at this point still has that, what happens happens, carefree attitude, combined a little bit with his cockiness. And he's like, if it comes to it, I'll kill him. And I'll kill your husband, I'll kill everyone else. We'll make a war. We'll go to war over it. And then he calls it the war for Cersei's cunt, which he gets slapped. And a moment here, there's nothing lewd, but with how he grabs a hold of Cersei from behind and she's like, get off of me, that makes me think of something we're going to see later on in season 4 that a lot of people threw shade at. Those who watch the episodes along with me or have already seen the show, you already know what moment I'm talking about. But it is something to note because that is coming up pretty quickly. Another little small moment is the first kill story, which is the only part of the episode that Robert Baratheon appears in, but it's a nice little scene. You can tell he's had a few cups in, he's reminiscing, he's in that type of mood. He's talking with Sir Barristan Selmy about their first kills. Barristan's was quick, whereas Robert's was during the rebellion where he got unhorsed and had to cleave in somebody with his hammer, and then when he was dealing the killing blow, the guy's like, wait! And then he's talking about they never tell you how they defecate when they die. And then he asks Jaime to tell him his first war story. And he hears, and this is where we hear about the Smiling Knight and his little band of people. And I just love how Syrio seems to be a little nostalgic when he interjects in that part, like, I was there that day, like with pride. I find that moment interesting because, as we'll find out, I think it's the last episode of this season or maybe beginning of next, he does still hold some resentment for Jaime. Or could be resentment, but it could also be him pointing out the fact that that man does not need to take my position. But it does show that he does still respect Jaime a bit, despite Jaime's past sins involving the death of the Mad King. And they do bring it up, mainly because Robert wants to know what the Mad King's final words were, and he tells him, burn them all. An interesting set of last words, which we're going to find out more about the context of those words later on. But what I like here is the look on Robert's face after he hears, because you can tell he's wondering, just what does that mean? Which that kind of balances out and connects back to a scene we see earlier when Ned first arrives in King's Landing. So a nice little segue there back to Ned's part of the arc. He arrives in King's Landing, he's going for the small council meeting. Now before he gets to the small council chamber, he first goes into the room where the Iron Throne is. And this is our first peek at the Iron Throne. It's a decent sized throne, nice little chair. They got the aesthetic right. Now in the books it's way larger, so it's a more grandiose one. But I can see why they scaled back on it for practicality's sakes when it comes to a set piece, and plus its design allows them to work in some interesting little dialogue bits later. Now this is a nice little place to have a little conversation between Ned and Jaime, where they're talking about, oh, it's a good thing you're here, and it leads to them talking about the day Ned's brother and father died in there. And, when Ned interjects, like, hey, why didn't you do something then? And then, of course, Jaime brings up an interesting point. It's like, no one else was doing anything. What do you think would have happened to me if I tried to interject there? This whole conversation is very interesting and makes you wonder, did they actually have a conversation about this at any time? Based on what we're going to hear from Jaime later on, he didn't. And I kind of wish I had written down some lines from the conversation here so I can bring it in here, but it is a fun one. I'm going to, before I upload this, I'll try and see if it's on YouTube so I can put it in the description box for those of you who haven't watched the episode. It's one of those ones that once you watch it, you're like, you can definitely see why later on when we have a certain wolf judge the lions, that bit of dialogue, you can see why. There's a lot of resentment and long held back anger there. But of course you can understand, given Ned's character and everything, why he feels the way he does. And once he gets to the small council chamber, the politics start to begin. All the characters introduce themselves. The only one he has any real affection for is Renly, which I didn't write Renly's actor down, but they got a good actor to play Renly. And he doesn't look exactly like Robert like he's supposed to be in the book, like a younger Robert, but more fit. But he definitely looks like he could be related to Robert in the show. Some good casting there. He's the only one Ned really gets along with, even though, as we're going to find out later, he's still trying to play at politics. The other two are just being a bit more obvious in their plays. And, of course, Ned just doesn't want to go there. They might be obvious in their plays, but not obvious in which way they're going. I will say that. Like Varys always keeps his cards close to the vest unless he likes you and he's working with you. As we're going to find out, he is going to be working with Ned here. And he is how he is. And of course, Littlefinger, he's always scheming. Even this early on, you can tell he's scheming. But I will say, this early on, I knew he was going to be a schemer, but I just didn't know exactly where those schemes were going to go, despite knowing what happens to Ned at the end of this season. I just did not know I was going to go there, but it was one of those moments to where the scene was playing out. I'm like, oh no, he's going to do it. And then when it happened, I'm like, I knew it. But at least he's honest. He even puts it up in that scene, but we'll get to that when we get to that episode later on. You definitely see that there's no love between Ned and Littlefinger. They have that animosity there. And just based on what little dialogue we hear, we can see why. His older brother Brandon cut him in a duel for Catelyn's hand. They only mention it very much in passing, but that's what happened. For those of you who don't know, Brandon Stark, Ned's older brother, was betrothed to Catelyn Tully. Littlefinger was a ward of Catelyn's father. He used to always hang out with her and her sister Lysa. Littlefinger was in love with Catelyn, so when he heard, he decided to challenge Brandon to a duel for her hand, and Brandon accepted. And he promised Catelyn he wouldn't kill the boy, but he did injure him. And of course, Littlefinger was eventually sent away. But there's more to that, which I'll get to that later on here. But just know there is a little bit more to why he was sent away. But he's always held some resentments for the Starks there, which leads to his whole backstory. And there's a lot of fan speculation involving part of this, and his whole thing about power, money, and how to win the game a different way. And I'm just going to get it right here. One of those fan theories, and I actually do like this one, is that because of what he said he saw, Littlefinger is the one that indirectly started Robert's rebellion, because he's the one that lit the spark that sent Brandon into there, for him going, come out and die, that led to him being burned by the Mad King. Now if that ends up what happens in the books, well played, that'd be a good one. Whether or not we'll actually find out that's what happened or not, or if it's just going to always be fan speculation and conjecture, is what it is. But it's one of those theories I'm like, I would not mind that if that actually is the case. In addition to Ned getting used to the small council, he now has to put up with the fact that Robert wants a tournament in his honor. And to add to this, the crown is in debt by 6 million gold dragons. And Ned hates this. He's like, you tell me Robert Arryn got us 3 million? No, I'm telling you he got us 6 million. All because Robert just can't deal with it. This is one of those things where you can see that, to use wrestling terminology, the chase is better than the reign. To use it that there's more money in the babyface chasing for the title than him actually reigning for any length of time. That's why people like Dusty Rhodes and others usually would have like smallish world title reigns. You know, comparatively speaking to the people that they took it off of or other ones. Whereas ones like Hogan and San Martino, there was money in the long reign. Robert is definitely one of those kings where he can definitely take it. He probably does not work well as the ruling king, especially given all the baggage he had about losing the woman he said he loved, and then all the crap he has to deal with. Obviously, drinking and eating himself into a stupor, and all the other stuff he does. I mean, he kind of had that personality before, but he definitely would have worked better as a meager lord than as a king with how he spends and everything. Probably Renly would have been a better king. Probably, I don't know if I'd say Stannis would have been at that time, but you never know. He might have been a fairer king, like less given to his preconceived biases. But of the three that started the rebellion, even though he doesn't like it, Ned probably would have been the better king from just how he handles the realm financially. The other stuff, but you never know. It's one of those what-if scenarios. Would have been interesting to see. Of course, the girls are also getting used to it. Sansa still reeling from Lady's death. Arya's mad at her sister because of it. And of course, Ned has to talk with them both about it. He tries to butter up Sansa, but he forgets, oh yeah, she's trying to become an adult now. This is one of those things that makes a little bit more sense when you look at their ages in the books, where she's an adolescent going into early teenage years, whereas here she's like in her mid-teens-ish, if I'm counting the years right, like a year or so older. One of those things like, oh, I guess he forgot that she doesn't play with dolls anymore. But I'm still certain that probably are some girls around the age she's supposed to be that still at least would collect dolls. But, you know, she's the betrothed of the crown prince, so the whole thing, I'm too good for dolls, combined with her not liking the fact that he's the one who had to kill Lady, probably why she's being a little Sansa-cold towards him. Arya, he goes and has a talk with, and this is where he finds out that she has a needle. And they don't bring up Jon's name, but he recognizes it. And this is a nice little bonding moment between father and daughter. And it's unspoken here, but just based on the way that Sean Bean plays the character and what he was told about his character's backstory, you can definitely see that Arya is reminding him a lot of his sister, Lyanna. And they do mention that Lyanna looked a lot like Arya, acted a lot like Arya, the touch of the wolf's blood that Brandon also had. That's what they call it when one of the Starks is a little bit more wild, not more cold and soft-spoken like Ned is. And it's a nice little bit of subtext in this scene that you can tell that's what's going on, but they don't have to speak it. It's Sean Bean letting his performance and the way he articulates his words, the way his body language is, sell the performance. So it's a nice little applause there. Those wondering about the whole wolf's blood thing and all that, maybe I'll talk about that in a later episode. Not in here, because I don't want to drag on this episode with too many sidebars involving that, but it is a nice little attention to detail. This leads into him actually hiring Syrio Forel to be her sword instructor, or as he calls it, our dancing teacher. Because since it is a Bravosi style sword, because she is female, a little bit more on the leaner side, he figures like, yeah, maybe the water dance would be a better type of fighting style for her. And Milto as Syrio, he does an excellent job. You know, he has a lot of good lines here. A sword is part of your arm. Can you drop part of your arm? Boy, girl, you are a sword. And his lesson showing her how to hold the sword properly, how to stand properly, move. Every bruise a lesson, as we're going to find out, he says. Giving her exercises later on and how to increase her speed and her stance. And about when it's a fight, it's not all in what you first see, it's more the tells. A nice little first lesson here, and you can definitely see that from the beginning, Syrio and Arya, they're getting along famously. Now, as I mentioned, Catelyn arrives. She meets Littlefinger almost right away. He hides her in a brothel, which Catelyn being mad about that, you can understand why she's mad. I mean, me, the Lady of Winterfell, and you're hiding me in a brothel? How dare you? The nerve of you. And I love the little bit of comedic moments here, or like one moment where a couple topless prostitutes are coming out of an inner office, and Littlefinger just looks at them and he's like go, ixnay on the booby ray. He eventually calms Catelyn down because Catelyn views him like a younger brother, even though she has a younger brother, but like an additional one, even though Littlefinger still does love her. So there is still that little bit of bond, even though they haven't seen each other in years. They hash it out, and along with Varys, they show the dagger, which Varys, knowing about it, all he has to say is he has birds up there, which I don't remember if in the show we ever find out who they were, but we know from other stuff it's usually little children, so it's probably little children up there that, stable boys that pass little stuff like that along. Like, probably wrote a thing, like Bran, attempted assassination, Valerian steel dragon dagger, something like that. Now, the fun thing about this is that Varys does not know who this blade belongs to, which I find very interesting, considering the blade used to be up in King's Landing. So how does Varys not know who owns it? Now, there's the possibility that Varys is lying here. That he's saying he doesn't know it, just so he can see if Littlefinger has any information. And Littlefinger goes right into it, plays his hand, but as we'll find out later, he doesn't tell the full truth. Because, as like that whole thing I mentioned about Littlefinger possibly starting the rebellion, he's going to say something in order to cause another conflict. And in this case, it's one between the Lannisters and the Starks. Which would make sense. I mean, if this whole war that's going to spark is based on the War of the Roses, you have to have a reason for the two houses that are based on the two houses that fought in the War of the Roses to be fighting. And here, framing that house for the attempted assassination of one of the members of the other house makes sense. Although, in all honesty, technically it's only stretching that part of the truth by a little bit, because technically the Lannisters did try to kill Brandon, only it wasn't when they thought it was. They're the ones that pushed him. They're not the ones that sent the cat's paw, at least to them. If we're going based on that little bit of info I mentioned in the previous episode, it was going to be Joffrey, who is part Lannister. Now, the reason for him wanting to do this, of course, is best summed up by a line that Varys says, I think in next season. He would burn the entire country to the ground if he could be king of the ashes. One way for him to go up, and as Littlefinger even says himself in a later episode, chaos is a ladder. And, as we'll see in later seasons, it does work to a point. And, of course, just keep that in mind, what all happens here, because I believe the next episode or the episode after that is going to really come to a forefront with an episode ender. Because this episode ends with a duel, but I don't know if it's the next one, but it'll end with a good banger. I'm like, ooh, now stuff is really getting serious. Now we look at some little trivia here. One line I like that's often attributed to Ned that they start here is a line that he says that everything before the word but is horseshit, or some other phrase like that, which is true in certain contexts, is that if you're going to lead up to something, everything you say before but is meaningless. It's just fluff to try to pad it, and also try to make the blow a little bit less. The fun thing is we never actually hear Ned say that directly, but I can't think of any time throughout the course of the show where it would make sense for him to say it. And, of course, we learn later on he never said it to his daughters, only to his sons, so it makes sense. It's not something you'd want to say to your daughters. I do like, though, that they incorporate that into the scene with Yoren, Benjen, and Tyrion, which I'm not going to go into, but it's a nice little moment. Another little thing, this is the first episode without any deaths of any kind. A rarity for this show, but it does happen. And based in dialogue, we do hear a little bit about the Night's Watch and their members, but it doesn't go into it directly. But here's the breakdown for those of you who have it. We have three different groups. You have the Rangers, who go beyond the wall, like Benjen. They're the main fighting force, because they're the ones that go out. Then we have the Builders, who repair the wall and the different castles along the wall. And then we have the Stewards, who cook, butcher, and hunt food. Makes sense. They're the ones that keep everybody fed and make sure that the Night's Watch is still alive. And I'm sorry I didn't mention him. I just called him the drill instructor from hell. But Sir Alistair Thorne, there's going to be more backstory about him coming up. I wrote it down in this episode, but I think I'll leave it for another episode to actually go into this to explain why he's treating Jon the way he is. But just keep that in mind. There is some backstory there, and I don't remember fully if they go into all of it in the show. But just in case they don't, I am going to mention it in this. All in all, this is a good third episode. It continues the plot threads that were started in the previous two. starts to up the stakes a little bit, but it's as you watch these episodes in sequence, you see the stakes slowly move up more and more, and of course leads to what happens and leads to events that will keep the next couple seasons going. The political and war intrigue continues here.